All right, class, welcome back. We're in 8.2 and we're still working on solving quadratic equations. This time we're going to solve them using the quadratic formula, or the quadratic equation. So those are the same thing. People use those interchangeably. The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Each of these represent is the coefficients here. So the coefficient of the squared term is a, the coefficient of the variable to the first power is b, and the constant is the value c. So when you're identifying a, b, and c, you need to put the equation in this format. So for instance, if you were given the problem 2x squared is equal to 4x plus 3, this is not in this format. So in order to identify a, b, and c for the quadratic equation, you need to put everything equal to 0. We want to keep the coefficient of the x squared term positive. So let's move everything to that side. Again, we want to keep this positive. It'll just make life easier. So I'm going to subtract 4x from both sides and negative 3. So on this side we'll have 0. And a 2x squared minus 4x minus 3. Now that I have it in the standard form, then I can identify a, b, and c. So a is, again, the coefficient of the x squared term, which is 2. B is negative 4. The sign in front of it goes with it. So this is the coefficient here, this is the coefficient here, and this is the constant. The way I like to think about b, or the opposite of b, I like to think that this isn't negative b, but it's the opposite of b. So whatever the value of b is. And the reason why we have b in a parenthesis here is because you want to make sure you include the negative in the squaring. Okay. So now I'm just going to take and replace each of these values. So x is going to be equal to negative b, or the opposite of b, which in this case is negative 4. So it's going to be 4 plus or minus the square root of b squared. B is negative 4, and again I want to make sure I square the negative as well. It's part of what's being squared. Minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is negative 3, all over 2a. Which in this case is 2. Then what we're going to do is we're going to simplify underneath the radical. So negative 4 squared is going to be 16, and 6 times 4 or 8 times 3 or whatever is going to be a positive 24. So this would give us the square root of 40, and now we want to take the square root of this. We want to break this down to 4 and 10, and now I'm going to plug this all back in and say plus or minus the square root. The square root of 4 is 2 on the outside here. Square root's 10. So breaking down just the radical part here and here, but now bringing down all of the rest. This 4 is this one, 2 times 2 is this 4 here. This 2 right here came from the square root of 4 is 2, and this 10 came from here. Okay, so this is what the answer looks like, but what we want to do is we can actually still simplify this because all of the coefficients are all of these have a 2 in common. So if I take a 2 out of this 4 divided by 2 is 2. If I take a 2 out of here, then I just have 1 square root of x, or square root of 10. And if I take a 2 out of here, then this is just over 2. So here is a simplified version, and this is what x equals. Again, I want to point out this is 2 separate answers. X is equal to 2 plus the square root of 10 over 2, and is equal to 2 minus the square root of 10 over 2. Okay, so process that we did here. Let's go through the process. So when we're working with a quadratic equation, our first step is to get everything in this format, the x squared plus bx plus c equal to 0. Then you identify so that you can identify a, b, and c. Then we're going to substitute those values into the quadratic equation, or the quadratic formula. I'm just going to call it the quadratic form. We're going to substitute those into here. Okay, and then the third thing we're going to do is simplify the root and the rest of the expression. Okay, so those were the steps that we just followed. So let's do another one. And a lot of times the harder work is actually going to be up front here, not plugging it in here. So let's try 1/2 y squared is going to be equal to y plus 1/2. Now, because we don't want to deal with fractions with the quadratic formula, I'm not only going to, subtract these over, but I want to get rid of the fractions. So part of this, putting it into this format, is we want to clear any fractions that we have. It'll make it a lot easier for us. So I'm going to do that by finding the LCD. The LCD here is 2. And once all of the denominators are the same, then we will have, so this is a 1/1y. So the LCD is 2. This already has the 2, so we need a 2 here. And when they all have the same denominator, then we can just only look at numerators. So now this would say y squared is equal to 2y plus 1. Okay, again, so I'm going to identify that LCD, build up the denominators, or use the LCD to multiply all of it. And regardless of how you think of that, you will still come up with the same thing. So if I were to distribute this 2 instead, this would be 2 times 1/2. That's still the y squared right here. This would be 2 times y, which is this 2y, and this would be just plus 1. So whether you build up the denominator or you distribute it, it doesn't matter. You can use whichever method you want to clear the fractions, but once you've cleared the fractions, then you want to get this equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract the 2y and the 1. So we'll have y squared minus a 2y minus 1 is equal to 0. Here, then I'm going to identify a, b, and c. In this case, a is 1, b is -2, and c is -1. So now we just finished step 1, clear the fractions first. Now we're going to substitute a, b, and c into the quadratic formula. So I've got -b, or the opposite of b. In this case, b is -2, so the opposite of -2 is going to be 2, plus or minus the square root of b, which is -2, the whole thing is being squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is -1, all over 2 times a, which again is still 1. Now I'm going to simplify the root first. Underneath the root, we've got 4 and a plus 4. -4 times 1 times -1 is this plus 4 here. Okay, so we've got the square root of 8, which is going to simplify to 4 and 2, so this is going to simplify to 2 root 2. To bring down the rest of the quadratic formula, we've got a 2 right here, 2 plus or minus this, all over 2. Again, I want to simplify the entire expression now at this point. We're going to look for in all 3 of these spaces and see if they have a common factor. In this case, the common factor is 2. So I'm going to divide a 2 out of here, a 2 out of here, and a 2 out of here. Anything divided by 1 is just itself. So these are the two values for x, 1 plus the square root of 2 and 1 minus the square root of 2. So that's with a little simplification up front. Using the quadratic formula is really just taking methodical steps through the process. So again, the only things you really need to remember is I want to just get everything equal to 0 so that I can identify a, b, and c, and then just plug it in and simplify using the order of operations. Let's do a couple more so we can see some different types of solutions. So this one contained a radical in the solution. And do a couple more here. So 8w squared plus 8w plus 1 is equal to 0. All right, well, this is already in this format for me, so life is good. A is going to be equal to 8, B is going to be equal to 8, and C is going to be equal to 1. So I'm just going to start plugging this in now and say that negative B, or the opposite of B, is negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times A, which is 8, times C, which is 1, all over 2 times A. So underneath here, the square root, I'm going to get 64. 8 times 8 is 64, minus 32. So we will get the square root of 32, which is going to be 2 and 16. So bringing down the rest of the formula, we got negative 8 plus or minus 4 root 2. 16, square root of 16 is 4. And the square root of 2 just has to stay. All over 2 times 8, which is 16. Again, want to check every time, the entire expression when I'm done, if these have anything in common. And if they do, I need to simplify them. So here we have a common factor, greatest common factor of 4. So we're going to reduce this to take a 4 out of here, that's going to be a negative 2. Then take a 4 out of here, that's going to be plus or minus just the square root of 2. And then take a 4 out of here, and that's going to be over 4. Do want to point out that some people might separate this out into something that looks like this. And if that's the case, then this could be reduced to a 1/2 plus or minus the square root of 2 over 4. These are the same answer. This is the same as this, just in a different format. On the test, I'll write them like this, but again, in other places you might see them written in this format. So just be aware of that. Okay, so let's try one more. Okay, so another one with fractions. This is in this format, but I don't want to plug in fractions, so we're going to clear the fractions by identifying the LCD. In this case, the LCD is 8. This has a denominator of 8, but this denominator is 1, and this denominator is 2. So to make this a denominator of 8, I'm going to have to multiply both the top and bottom by 8. Here I'm going to have to multiply both the top and bottom by 4. When all the denominators are the same, you can just get rid of the denominators. So what would be left here is x squared plus an 8x plus 20. And that would all be equal to 0. So now it's in this format. We can identify A is going to be 1, B is going to be 8, and C is going to be 20. Okay, so plugging that in, we've got negative B, or the opposite of B, which in this case is negative 8. Plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Underneath here, again, we're going to have, hey, 64. And 4 times 20 is a negative 80. So you're going to see here that we're going to get a negative number underneath this radical. So when this is negative under the radical, then you're going to get solutions that have I in them, right? Because this is going to factor to the square root of negative 1 and the square root of 16. So to simplify this, then we will just have 4i. And again, this is going to be plus or minus that. And then I have a negative 8 from here and a 2 right here. Again, want to simplify all of this by factoring out a common factor here of 2, which would leave us with negative 4 plus or minus 2i. These would be our two answers here. One of them is negative 4 plus 2i, and the other one is negative 4 minus 2i. So this is using the quadratic formula.